We love blue skies here on DF Retro, but now, as the vibrant colors of summer are purged from the landscape and replaced with a burnt orange hue, our attention now turns to a different kind of experience: horror. For horror gaming fans, there are few titles held in as high regard as Silent Hill 2. A masterpiece from a time when Konami stood as one of the best publishers in gaming. This solemn, deeply reflective title stands as one of the PlayStation 2's finest experiences, and fans around the world continue to heed its beckoning. But there's more to Silent Hill 2 than the experience itself. Despite its foggy exterior and dimly lit corridors, Silent Hill 2 is an understated technical marvel which introduced a whole host of impressive new visual effects quite unlike anything else available at the time. It also received a number of different ports, all of which failed to live up to the original PS2 version in some ways. So turn off the lights, put on some headphones, and join me on the shores of Toluca Lake as we descend into the world of Silent Hill 2. The original Silent Hill made its mark with a focus on psychological horror. It presented an experience quite unlike anything else on the PlayStation. It was a game made to capitalize on the success of Resident Evil, but it soon became evident that the team had created something much more meaningful. It was a success, and its success immediately triggered the development of a sequel. Examining the praise bestowed upon its first game then, the team came to understand what it was that the fans enjoyed most, and set out to expand upon this for the sequel. It just so happened that the PlayStation 2 was right around the corner, a perfect fit for the next project. Early tests were promising, and highlighted what could be achieved on PlayStation 2, as we see here in this early demonstration which brings Sybil to life on Sony's new system. But the game's art director, Masahi Tsuboyama, wasn't satisfied with the visual design of the original game and opted to use real-world photos to help define the look of this new installment. Dilapidated buildings and cluttered ruins served as the starting point, and in fact, the game's introduction sequence here in the restroom was the very first room developed. This helped define the look of the game. Silent Hill 2 would make appearances at various trade shows as development continued, from its appearance at TGS 2000 to the full presentation at E3 2001. It quietly became an anticipated game for many, but those of us paying attention could never have known just how memorable the final product would actually be. Silent Hill 2 would be released on September 24th, 2001, the same day as Ico. And I purchased both of these games on day one and still have my original copies here today. On this day of its release, I waited until sunset, then eagerly booted the game for the very first time. No warnings about violent images, no startup videos. Just a quick logo, followed by a completely silent title screen. How fitting. It was a journey I would never forget, and one that impressed me on a technical level as well. To fully appreciate what Silent Hill 2 offered, we need to think about this as a 2001 release. The interaction of light and shadow in video games was a relatively new concept, and Silent Hill 2 offered something many of us had never before seen in real time. Through the game's real-time cutscenes, high polygon models were used to depict a level of character detail exceeding what we had come to expect at this point. The rounded facial features and the detailed clothing looked remarkable for its day. The subtle use of depth of field in many scenes, such as this very first shot, was still relatively new for the medium and very effective. When the players finally handed control, many sat there waiting for the game to switch to the real-time graphics. It was already there. This is paired with, for the time, remarkably high-quality textures. The PlayStation 2 had gained a reputation for its difficulties in handling high-quality texture maps, but in the right hands, the system could shine. While not especially high resolution for today, the artwork manages to avoid the tiled look that was so common back then and create a filthy canvas which served the atmosphere greatly. But the real star of the show lies in the building of its atmosphere. In the previous generation, fogging was heavily used in order to reduce rendering demands while concealing pop-in. It was a technical requirement for Silent Hill 1, but the team discovered that this effect actually added significantly to the game's feeling of uncertainty. So while the PlayStation 2 could have rendered many of these areas with an increased draw distance, it would have also detracted from the atmosphere, so the team opted instead to focus on exploiting the high fill rate of the PlayStation 2 to create this beautiful swirling fog effect from many different alpha texture layers. The extra immersion made possible by this effect had a transformative effect on the game's atmosphere. But indoors, a small flashlight is your only companion. And it's here that we see an example of one of the very first implementations of real-time dynamic world shadows projected by a local shadow caster. Taking advantage of the unique PlayStation 2 hardware, the developers were able to replicate soft stencil shadows across the game. This manifests itself as shadows projected from the flashlight James carries in his pocket. As you move around the scenery, objects within the scene and the environment itself can display real-time shadows. It's a supremely impressive technique for the time. While it's true that PlayStation 2 does not actually support a proper stencil buffer in hardware, it is actually possible to produce extremely similar results using an alpha-blended operation instead. And the PS2 could execute all of this in a single pass, making it fast. Then we have the sound. The audio created by Akira Yamaoka is also hugely important to the experience. But how that audio actually works is rather fascinating. Most games today use pre-recorded audio files that are played back by the system on request. Think of it like an MP3 file of sorts. On PlayStation 2, however, the entire soundtrack is actually sequenced by the PS2's audio chip rather than pre-recorded and played back as a digital audio file. The system plays back defined samples in real time using the instructions programmed by the sound designer. This allows greater flexibility and enables perfect track looping. This was actually a common approach on the PlayStation 2, but for those unfamiliar with the concept, think back to how the sound chip on the Super NES worked. This is essentially the next generation equivalent. Of course, that's hugely oversimplifying things here, but you get the basic idea. Silent Hill 2 also employed something known as S-Force, which is a 3D audio solution designed to give the illusion of 3D sound using just 2 speakers, and it can be quite effective even if you're used to the 7.1 mixes of today. When taken as a whole then, the end result is a highly detailed atmospheric game world full of nightmarish sounds that captured the imaginations of all those who played it. Silent Hill 2 is also a game that was crafted specifically for the PlayStation 2 hardware, which is why its various ports remain incredibly fascinating today. The first port of the game was released just 3 months after the PS2 original, for Microsoft's brand new Xbox console. The Xbox was a powerful machine with more modern hardware than PlayStation 2, but that doesn't mean it was simple to translate a custom PS2 focused engine to Microsoft's new system. There are several key changes made this time, one which improves visuals over the PS2 original, and at least 3 or so others which feel like a step down. Let me explain. One of the first changes you'll note centers on the game's presentation of the fog effect. In comparison to the PS2 original, the fog is pared back on Xbox. These fill rate heavy effects were often pared back when ported to other platforms, so it's no surprise to see it in this game as well. It still looks pretty good on Xbox, of course, but the effect is diminished overall. Then we have the full motion video sequences. On PS2, these sequences were stored in the PSS format, likely using the MPEG-2 codec, operating at a full 60 frames per second. The folder on the disc is just shy of 1.6 gigabytes. On Xbox then, these movies were re-encoded into everyone's favorite BINC format at only 30 frames per second, resulting in a dramatic loss in quality. In comparison, the Xbox files are around 600 megabytes, less than half that of the PS2 version. And going forward, these files would become the standard files for every other version of Silent Hill 2. The end result is lower image quality and a slower frame rate. While not necessarily important for gameplay, the high frame rate used in these videos did give it an element of strangeness that did add to the experience, and that's lost in this translation. Then we have the audio, and it's here that the Xbox version differs in a few key areas. For one thing, many of the sound effects are stored at a lower quality. Take a listen. Beyond that, the game's soundtrack is now stored as pre-recorded medium bitrate ADX files. They are no longer generated in real time by the sound chip, rather simply played back. This can lead to looping errors and other minor audio issues. Beyond that, while the Xbox was the first console ever to support Dolby Digital 5.1 output, Silent Hill 2 only supports 4.0 mode. The overall impression is that it sounds somewhat flat overall on Xbox in comparison to the original PS2 version. There's also minor hitches and skips here and there that occur throughout the experience on Xbox, which can take some of the polish off the top. But the Xbox version does have one advantage: a per pixel flashlight cone. Taking advantage of the NVIDIA graphics processor included in the Xbox, the flashlight beam on Xbox is now rendered with per pixel precision, as opposed to per vertex on PS2. The difference is clear, as the PS2 technique highlights the triangular edges of each vertex in the scene, leading to noticeable artifacts. Xbox also maintains the same soft shadows as we saw on PS2. Due to lower level hardware access, it actually is possible here to use the same PS2 shadowing solution on the Xbox. Of course, overall, the shadows would be less efficient on the Xbox, but the GPU was actually fast enough to cope with the extra load, so it wasn't a problem in the end. Ultimately, while the Xbox version does fall short in some areas, it's probably the second best port of the game in terms of accuracy. Unfortunately, things will only get worse from here. Let's go. Next up is the 2002 release of Silent Hill 2 on the PC. This version of the game was designed to run using DirectX 8 and as such is actually lacking more visual effects than the Xbox version while carrying all of its flaws. But first, let's take a look at its advantages. While the port itself is not great, the community has stepped up and made it a pretty decent way to play Silent Hill 2 today. The SH2 proxy, for instance, enables support for higher resolutions, anti-aliasing, faster loading, and more. There's even a pack out there which improves upon the awful full-motion video quality included in the original release. So yeah, the actual release of the game included the same audio and video files as the Xbox version, so while sound remains kind of a problem here and doesn't sound great, it is at least possible to improve upon the low-quality video situation. But even when running in high resolution, the game never looks quite right. The first thing you'll note is the awful noise filter, which pales in comparison to what we saw on PlayStation 2. It just looks ugly. Now you can turn it off, of course, which really does clean up the game. And it's neat seeing Silent Hill 2 at a higher resolution without film grain. But it also kinda spoils the art to some degree. The lack of clarity on PlayStation 2 as a result of the lower resolution does actually add something to the tension, I think. Though this is obviously a matter of opinion. Beyond that, the fog remains pared back just as we saw on Xbox, and it actually seems to have been reduced even further. It's a pretty cheap looking effect now that doesn't really convey the same feelings as the original game. Then we have the shadows. On PC, shadows are displayed as simple hard-edged volumes. This is likely due to the limitations of DirectX 8 and hardware of the time. The API simply didn't allow enough access to the hardware in order to achieve results on par with PS2, nor would graphics cards of that day have been fast enough to actually emulate the same effect. The end result here is that Silent Hill 2 on the PC is a sharper version of the game with missing effects, pared back shadows, and various other minor issues. Even with the community patch installed, it still feels less polished and terrifying than the original game, but really it's not a bad way to play it on a modern machine either if you want to enjoy the game in HD. For nearly a decade, these three ports remained the only way to experience Silent Hill 2, but in 2012 Konami released one of the most infamously terrible conversions of all time, the Silent Hill HD Collection. Now, this is a collection with a lot of history beyond the scope of this episode, from the troubled development and legal issues surrounding its voice actors, which is covered in extreme detail by the fine fellows at Twin Perfect, to the condescending way in which the fans were dealt with by people working on the project. Things weren't looking good. And before its release, the voice acting thing really was a pretty big deal. Listen to this comparison here.
In my restless dreams, I see that town.
I see that town.
Silent Hill.
Silent Hill.
The new acting isn't inherently bad, but it misses some of the point of the original characters, and really, when you're bringing back a classic like this that fans are so attached to, it's the kind of thing you really shouldn't mess with. This all was eventually sorted out, and when the game was released, it was possible to at least play with the old voices, at least in Silent Hill 2. But it soon became evident that changing the voice acting would be the least of this game's issues. You see, Konami handed this port off to Hijinks Studios, a studio not all that experienced with these types of projects, and the results were even worse than we could have imagined. Yes, it's actually worse than High Voltage Studios' work on the Zone of the Enders HD collection, which was so bad that it had to be fixed by another company. While I previously owned every other version of this game showcased in the episode, I only just got my hands on the HD collection this week. I originally avoided it out of principle, but I had to give it a shot for this episode. And at first glance it appears to be based on the already inferior PC version of the game, but it winds up looking worse all around. I'm even playing it here on PlayStation 3, which is the only version to have received a patch designed to solve some of these issues. Right away, it's clear that something is amiss. The contrast is wrong, and there's just something about the game that doesn't look quite right. The depth of field here in this scene isn't right, and some of the texture changes just seem to lack the original grit. The presentation of the fog effect in this version is also the worst we've seen yet. It really looks dreadful to the point where you can see the edges around each alpha texture. And what is this thing back here? A similar problem is evident with the flashlight glow in other scenes. I mean, look at that. Then we have the edge of the fog effect itself, which just looks like a solid line drawn right in front of the player. It does not smoothly blend with the scenery at all, as we see on PlayStation 2. And now performance is terrible. The original game was designed to run at 30 frames per second, and on PlayStation 2 that was never an issue. The game didn't slow down, and that's pretty important when you're trying to tell a story like this. But as you can see, things aren't really very good in the HD version. Now this is the patched version of the game even, which includes a frame rate cap of 30 FPS, but when it was originally released, the frame rate was uncapped, making it even more unstable as it went all the way from, say, 60 frames per second down to this. It just feels so jerky in comparison. And running through this area really highlights just how broken the fog effect really is. It just doesn't look good, period, even if you compare it to the original game. Then when we get inside, we have the shadows, which no longer use the volume shadow technique presented on PlayStation 2. The new solution is ugly, with obvious artifacts along the edges and lots of limitations. It doesn't really display properly as you'd expect in many different scenes. I mean, look at this cutscene here. The shadows just cut off in this weird fashion, and it looks wrong overall. And lots of other little things as well, like the orangish glow of this scene as you step outside of the bowling alley. It's pretty much lost in the HD collection. Or this scene with Eddie in the bowling alley. If you look in the distance, you can actually see much more clearly all the distance behind him, which again, changes the mood somewhat. And then watch the end of this hallway as it emerges from darkness. That doesn't look right either, does it? And the whole game just looks kind of washed out. And even some of the aspects of gameplay actually fail to work properly as well. This initial sequence with Pyramid Head, for instance, it didn't work properly. I ran into this corner of the room and, well, nothing happened. He just remained off screen for a couple of minutes here until the fight ended. It just didn't work. What's going on here? And then of course we have the other normal things like the inferior sound still pulled from the Xbox version, and the reliance on upscaled low quality Bink movies from that same version again. In the end, I could sit here and nitpick for hours, but the takeaway is simple. The Silent Hill HD collection is the single worst way to experience Silent Hill 2 today. It's broken, glitchy, and ugly, and it does a disservice to the original experience. Now, I'm sure those that were working on this port originally wanted to do as good a job as possible within the constraints of the budget, but in the end it just didn't work out, and it really should never have been released like this. With that in mind then, you might be wondering, what is the actual best way to play the game then? Well, this is always going to be a matter of opinion, but my thoughts are pretty simple here. Grab a copy of the PlayStation 2 Greatest Hits version and play it on original hardware. It contains all of the content released for the game and offers the most accurate presentation. But if you'd rather play on a more modern platform such as the PC, I might actually recommend checking the game out on PCSX2, the PlayStation 2 emulator. You get all of the original visual effects intact and presented at a higher resolution. It looks really nice, I must say. Of course, there are a few things to consider here. If you play the game from the original DVD, for instance, you might actually run into some performance hitches while exploring the world. But I found that creating an ISO of that disc actually can solve this problem completely. Also worth noting that the FMV sequences don't actually display properly for some reason, at least in my testing, which is a bummer. But if you'd rather stick with a PC native application then, clearly it's Silent Hill 2 on the PC. The original DX8 version using the SH2 proxy. It's not a bad way to play it. Of course, you do have to put up with some of the limitations I mentioned earlier, such as inferior shadows and seriously reduced fog, but it's not bad. Of course, the Xbox version is no slouch either. You get 480p and the second most accurate presentation of Silent Hill 2. But please, just ignore the HD collection. Let us pretend that one never happened, okay? There is one more thing I wanted to mention though before we go, and that's actually the display you play the game on. Silent Hill 2 was designed for CRT televisions and expects the deep black levels that those displays can provide. Much of its horror was created with this technology in mind, and the overwhelming majority of modern flat panel displays in homes today cannot possibly do this game justice. The reason is simple. The glowing backlights of modern LCDs and even the glowing of many plasmas absolutely destroys the visuals in the presentation here, at least I think so. To experience it properly, you could grab an old CRT television and a PlayStation 2, which still looks great today, or you could pair that PS2 up with an XRGB FrameMeister and then connect that to something like an OLED TV. An LCD TV with really strong local dimming performance can also work, but really only OLED provides the level of darkness necessary for proper horror gaming. Okay, now that sounds insane to recommend an expensive TV like that just to play something like Silent Hill 2, and I'm not suggesting you buy one for that reason. But having just switched over to OLED myself, the perfect black levels has truly reinvigorated my love of horror games in a way that I didn't anticipate. So if you go TV shopping in the future and you love horror games, do keep that in mind. But that actually brings us to the end of this dark journey. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of DF Retro, and if so, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. I always enjoy discussing retro games and future ideas for the series. But that's all for now. Until next time then, stay retro. On the next episode of DF Retro.